Today begins a 5-part series on environmental justice, which might be defined this way: working for structures and systems that promote sustainable development and a planet with a future on which people can share all the blessings of life equally. We're glad you're here. I'm going to turn it over to Bill with a little bit of background about Bill. Bill is our friend. After a career in business, Mr. Hayes, here we go. Mr. Hayes has focused largely on addressing the problem of climate change with cost-effective solutions. He founded Clean Path Partners as a vehicle to expand the use of renewable electricity, and he's actively engaged in Citizens Climate Lobby, which promotes federal policy to address climate change. Bill is also actively involved in early stage venture capital as a member of Hyde Park Angels and is on the board of 2 public schools. Bill's business career involved 25 years with Fitch Ratings, which provides economic and financial research to institutional bond investors. Bill has an MBA in finance and statistics from the University of Chicago, a BA in economics from Carleton College, and holds a chartered financial analyst degree. Bill lives in Northfield with his wife and their 3 teenage boys. Welcome back, Bill.
I'm here today basically to talk about, there's a decision to make on Tuesday, and I don't know if some of you may have voted early or not, but if not, there's a decision on Tuesday, which there's an advisory question added to the ballot. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. It involves climate change and a solution to climate change. So thank you, and I'll jump in, and I understand I'll try to keep time for questions. And I'll also say that these are big topics. So this is going to just be sort of an outline of some big topics. Just as a sentence before that, I will say, after 12 months of, basically being in a pandemic and hibernation, I feel like this spring and this Sunday, this Easter Sunday especially, there's so much energy to renew our lives in this springtime, especially more than ever. So hopefully it allows us all to look at some of these big problems in new ways and hopeful ways as well, like climate change. Okay, so hopefully people can see this. And again, I'm going to talk about the advisory question for the new Trier Township that will be on the ballot on Tuesday. And this is basically what I'm going to talk about. What is the question that will be on the ballot? And then it's a 2-part question, actually. One is the problem of climate change, and 2 is the solution to climate change, which carbon pricing is what it suggests as the solution, and then Q&A at the end. So this is the question. Shall the US Congress pass legislation to place a carbon fee on fossil fuel producers where the collected revenue is given equitably back to American households, incentivizing businesses and consumers to reduce climate disrupting emissions? That's basically what the question is. And it's an important question because although no legislation directly comes from the choices made in this ballot, it provides information from real voters to policymakers about the willingness to address climate change and to address it with this solution. So first, just a comment on Citizens Climate Lobby, and that's, I'm a volunteer for Citizens Climate Lobby. I have been for the last 5 years or so. This is an organization that is focused exclusively on changing national policy to address climate change, and national policy in particular, not state policy so much, but building support for national policy to address climate change. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan, grassroots advocacy. It's basically democracy in action. There's about 100,000 volunteers, basically in every congressional district in the country. And the actions that we do are basic democracy, including this ballot advisory question today. So now getting into the issue of climate change. And this is perhaps the most important graph. You may have seen it before. This is the connection between the temperature of the planet and the amount of emissions that are produced by humans, basically. The red line is the average global temperature. You can see it, and this is from 1880 till the present. You see it increasing quite rapidly the last 100 years or so, 70 years. And that correlates quite closely with the shaded parts, which are the amount of annual carbon emissions from the burning of coal, the burning of oil, which becomes gasoline and airplane fuel, and the burning of natural gas for cooking and heating. It's not a surprise that these are correlated, because scientists have known since the 1800s that gases that have more carbon dioxide trap heat, and they restrict the flow of heat. So it's like putting a blanket around the planet when the amount of carbon emissions increases. And since the 19th century, carbon emissions have gone up 43%, and the temperature has gone up 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And now, while that might not sound like a lot, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, every day it changes by more than that. You should be aware that in the last 10,000 years, the estimated change in the average temperature for the entire globe has been about 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So except for the last 100 years, when it's been double that amount. So the variation has increased, and the projection is that it will go up at least another 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter what we do. And it will go up significantly more than that if we don't do anything. In other words, multiples of the variation that happened in the entire recorded history of humans. So of course, the weather will change that we see day to day as the average temperature increases to such a significant extent. So what does increasing levels of CO2 and increasing global temperatures, what are the consequences? I think there are four main buckets to that. One is more frequent and severe weather, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, intense rain, flooding, hurricanes, as there's more water in the air and less water on the ground. Second bucket is sea level rise from melting ice caps and thermal expansion. The projection is perhaps 2 to 3 feet by the end of the century. And that puts about 570 cities and 800 million people in some level of risk that live along coastal areas. And especially when it's combined with more active or more frequent hurricanes, for instance. A third major bucket is mass extinctions from disrupted ecosystems in the plant and animal world. As you can imagine, the pace of change is faster than it's been in 10,000 years, and it's hard for plant and animals to keep up with that change in terms of their adaptions. And then the fourth bucket is the human part of the issue, which is increased migration, conflict, and inequality from the disrupted economies that come from all of the three things above that. So these are really big things that are consequences. And you've seen some of these pictures. This is Iowa, where I grew up a couple years ago. These are the megafires in California that you've seen. This is the shrinking of the ice cap. It's 40%. 40% of it has melted away already. But if you're like me, I'm an analyst, so I don't want the emotional. I don't want to see a picture that pulls at my emotions. I want to see data to say, well, is it really increasing or does it just seem like it? And this is information that NOAA records, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, from part of NASA. And so this is the number of billion-dollar plus weather events during the year. And so what this map shows is that there were 22 billion-dollar plus weather events in 2020. You see the hurricanes along the coast, 7 hurricanes. You see the droughts in California and various weather events in the rest of the country. And 22 of those it smashes the record, the prior record. The previous record was 16 weather events 2 years ago. And in the last 6 years, every year has had more than 10 weather events that are of at least $1 billion in damages. Whereas the prior 35 years, there have only been 4. So it's increasing in terms of damages, and it's increasing exponentially, it appears to be. So the consequences are large. And then this is something that I just saw from yesterday's paper, and it's the cherry blossom peak bloom dates. So this is from Kyoto in Japan. I thought this was appropriate for Easter Sunday and springtime. But they've been keeping track of the peak bloom date since 812. So for the last over 1,000 years, they've been measuring the peak bloom dates, and you can see the plot and how in the last 100 years or so, it has gotten earlier and earlier. As the line goes down, that average line, that is that corresponds to earlier days in the year when the peak bloom happens. So I think this is interesting because it is probably similar to pretty much all of to many of the blooms that you'll see in the US and in Chicago, for instance, as the weather has gotten warmer here as well. And you can imagine how that may be disruptive to, for instance, birds that and other organisms that whose ecosystems are tied to the dates of blooms for food and things like that. So now I'm going to move to really the second part of what I was going to talk about, and that is a solution to climate change. So it's moving from the negative, it's like the Easter Sunday, moving to the hopeful, the positive, the solution from all that negative stuff before. And I want to start with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the reason for that is this is the organization set up by countries around the world as part of the UN to provide a consensus regarding information for policymakers about climate change. You can imagine how difficult it would be to solve if every country made up their own data and made up their own analysis about climate change. So it is the scientific consensus as best that can be put together for the planet. And it was set up in the 1970s. So what they conclude is that there is a need to cut global emissions in half by 2030 and decarbonize completely by 2050 to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, and basically to keep global temperatures to only go up 1.5 degrees Celsius, which again is 3 times the total variation that happened in the 10,000 years before, which were 0.5 degree Celsius. So, and that gets us into some politics of, how do you, get national legislation to address this. We have the Biden administration has 100% clean energy economy and net zero emissions in the US by 2050, basically matching those IPCC recommendations as other countries are doing. You have basically 11 bills that have carbon pricing in Congress. And I'll talk more about what carbon pricing means as a solution that makes sense. And then these are just two other bills, but the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act at the bottom is the one I'm going to go into some depth about, because that is basically what the advisory question is referring to, which is the simple carbon pricing and carbon dividend approach to the problem. So carbon fee and dividend, Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, it was reintroduced in the new Congress last week. It's estimated to reduce emissions 30% in 5 years and to net zero by 2050. So it's all trying to be consistent with this IPCC recommendation. And so anyway, that's, and these are Illinois members of Congress that support this bill, including Representative Schakowsky from our district here. And by the way, as Citizens Climate Lobby representative, I'm the liaison with their office. So I met with their office last week as part of this new introduction of the bill. So let me get into how this works. How does the solution work? There's basically 3 parts. One part is to place a carbon price or a fee on fossil fuels at the first point of sale. So what does that mean? That means charging a fee, for instance, to coal miners, so that coal miners pay a fee based on the amount of carbon emissions that will be created when their coal is burned, when they sell it to an electricity plant and produce electricity. Also, a fee will be charged to, for instance, refineries, through which all crude oil goes and creates gasoline and airplane fuel and other fuels. So the fee to the refiners will be a function of how much emissions will be created when that gasoline is burned. And then a fee will also be charged to natural gas pipelines based on, again, the emissions that will be created when that natural gas is eventually burned. So in other words, there will be a fee on all the fossil fuel streams at the early point in that cycle. The other thing to mention is that the price will increase. It will start so small that it will be hardly noticeable by anyone. And it will gradually, year by year by year, increase so that by year 30, it will be so high that it will be difficult for anyone to afford it, and then people will choose other options. And they will have 30 years to gradually adjust and transition and plan for a rising incentive to shift away from fossil fuels. The second main ingredient or element of this bill is to return all of the net revenue equally to US households as carbon dividends. So if you think about that, what it means is that the carbon price will cause will cause some prices to increase depending on how much carbon emissions are in those electricity or other products. But offsetting that, on average, offsetting it completely, will be a dividend payment to each household. So whereas each household will have an incentive to shift away from fossil fuels, they will receive a dividend payment. So all proceeds will be dividended back to households. And then the third element is border carbon adjustment on certain carbon intensive goods. And that's needed in order to not create an incentive for all businesses to shift to other countries where there isn't a carbon fee. It will negate that incentive to move manufacturing to easier countries. And then just to mention, I'm going to sort of jump through some of these, but the main point of this, and is that the design of this is that it protects low and middle income households. And why is that? Why is that? Because higher income households actually buy more products that have carbon emission, that create carbon emissions. So higher income people will be paying a little bit more for their products, but only getting the same dividend back. Whereas low income they generate fewer emissions because they buy fewer products, so they will pay less in higher prices, but they will get the same dividends back. So it's naturally progressive. It naturally protects lower income who produce fewer emissions. And so this sort of sums up the key points about this plan. It reaches net zero by 2050. It's affordable clean energy because it provides an incentive to shift efficiently by businesses and consumers. So it's a low-cost solution. It puts money in everyone's pocket, but it actually benefits the lower income in terms of a net benefit. And it saves lives because there's also air quality issues and consequences to climate change, and it's saving those lives. And that has an environmental justice element to it also, because climate change's consequences are larger on lower income people that can't adjust as easily. So just to get into a little bit of the politics of this, and the idea that this policy approach is actually supported by a number of people. This was a poll given to all voters and Democrats and swing voters and Republicans. And you can imagine in our polarized economy that Republicans are maybe less supportive of this, but you might be surprised to see that even among Republicans, roughly half of the voters support this kind of policy. And it's particularly strong among Republicans under 40, where 75% of Republican voters under 40 support this kind of policy. They see climate change as an issue, and this being a way to solve it. And then these are various support, organizations that support fee and dividend, including many churches, Unitarian Universalist Association, Presbyterian Church, United Conference of Catholic Bishops, and various other organizations, including largely the business community, because they know that this is a cost-effective way to deal with climate change using incentives, using price incentives basically, versus government mandates that require certain policy options. So just to return to the question that you'll see on Tuesday, this is basically what this question is referring to. Should you place a fee on fossil fuel producers and give the revenue back to households, incentivizing businesses and consumers to reduce climate disrupting emissions? And to the extent a number of people say yes, that this is a good idea, that will be an important signal that policymakers can act on. So anyway, that's I hope that was clear. I'm open to questions, and I hope that besides voting Tuesday, that you can mention it to others, that and there's this other information about that Citizens Climate Lobby offers about climate change and this class of solutions in our particular bill that's out there that we support in particular. So that basically sums up what I was going to say, and I think I kept it roughly to the 30 minutes in order to leave plenty of time for question and answer. Let me just stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions. I actually prefer the question and answer because there's usually easier to answer more specifically to questions.
Yeah, Bill, thank you very much for that presentation. And by the way, may I have your PowerPoint?
Sure, absolutely.
You can send that, and then I can share that with people. Even after Tuesday, that's a very helpful PowerPoint.
Right.
And I'd like to have it to share it, if I may. And to remind folks, we're going to be ending today at 9:30, so people have some time to get to the pre-Easter service concert that starts today at 9:45. Bill, let me start with a question, if I may. Can you help us understand how do we get from these township advisory questions to actual federal legislation? How does that build? I mean, I assume this is a process of grassroots building, but more about how we get from where we are to where we want to go, which is the passing of this in Congress.
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, this advisory question is just one little sliver of the effort that is being made to pass legislation. And in fact, there's a lot of energy right now, I would say, in Congress and in the administration to make sure in 2021 something is done. And there's, in November, there's a the COP26 meeting among all the global countries. And that's, again, a time where the Biden administration wants to show that the US is back in the Paris Agreement and is taking big steps to do its part to reduce carbon emissions. So, so there's a lot of expectation that something will be done. So the advisory question is just one more piece of evidence, not just about the willingness to address climate change, but the willingness to address it with this, I would say, this class of solution, which is putting incentives on the fossil fuel industry, on the economy, basically, to shift in the most cost-effective way. So the bill is now outstanding. So one thing, just our goal is to get as many sponsors as possible, as quickly as possible, on this current bill that was just reintroduced last week.
Thank you.
So that it will be part of the negotiation and part of the solution that comes out of this in the next 3 to 4 months.
Yeah, I could imagine that if this passes township by township, it gives other activists the opportunity to go to their members of Congress who are not on board yet and say, look, 5 of the 7 townships in your congressional district have passed this. Why can't you support it now? Will you support it now?
Exactly.
Right?
And yes, for sure.
Yeah. I live in DuPage County and in York Township, and I think this was on our ballot last fall.
Okay.
So it's beyond Cook County. It's probably even beyond Illinois. But
yeah. Yep.
some questions have come in the chat. Greg Frazados says, Bill, thank you for arming us with this information. Does Hyde Park Angels currently support many renewable energy companies? And if so, what types?
Good question. Hyde Park Angels basically is the Chicago ecosystem and is sourcing all kinds of companies But I would say there's not very many renewable energy. If there is, I tend to be more interested in those and invest in them. And in fact, I've invested in and been involved in a battery company. You know, I think there's only been a few. Actually, the Hyde Park Angel, there's another startup organization that is even more focused on renewable energy in Chicago, and I think they do a lot more than Hyde Park Angels does. But anyway, we do as much as we can.
Thanks, Bill. Can you see the chat? Paul had asked what I think is a 5-part question. It might be better if you can actually see them. And for those who can't see the chat, I'll read them. Why a dividend instead of using money to invest in clean energy? Why not a fee on emitters versus carbon fuel producers paying a fee? How does this proposal differ from cap and trade? Will the fee differ by the degree of carbon in the fuel, such as natural gas versus coal? And lastly, what about the employees in the carbon industry? Will there be an effort to transition them to other employment?
Well, those are great questions, and I'll try to just go through each of them with what I know. Why instead of using money to invest in clean energy? You know, so one advantage of 100% dividend is that it removes the question of will the government spend the money wisely? And it makes it more attractive, for instance, to Republicans and the potential to have it be a bipartisan. But I will say that among the other carbon pricing bills, many of them use the money for many other options. So for instance, the Durbin Senate bill takes 25% of the money of the proceeds and puts it into clean energy and transition assistance and other uses, and only distributes 75%, focusing on the low incomes to make sure that they are beneficiaries of it. So it's a good question, and it's open to negotiation as this progresses. Okay, let me move on. Why not a fee on emitters versus carbon fuel producers? Well, maybe this is maybe there's a misunderstanding here. This is basically providing a fee on the well, it's providing a fee, charging a fee in the economy in the ways that it's easiest to charge the fee. It's charging it in the production chain where it's easiest to charge the fee. But in fact, it ends up causing the fee to be paid by the emitters of, the consumers and the producers that are involved in fossil fuel production and consumption are the ones that end up paying it. Okay, how does this differ from cap and trade? Well, it's similar. They're both prices on carbon. What cap and trade does is it fixes the amount of pollution and then lets the market figure out what the price will be. Whereas a fee and dividend sets the price of pollution, says $15 per ton of carbon emitted, and then lets the amount of pollution be determined by the market. So it's just two different ways to get to the same answer. They're both putting a price on carbon, and they're both reducing the quantity, but one is fixing the quantity and letting the price adjust. One's fixing the price and letting the quantity adjust. I don't know if that's clear, but will the fee differ by the degree of carbon in the fuel? Absolutely. It's calculated by the amount of carbon emissions that will be emitted when that fuel is burned. So in other words, natural gas is half of the emissions as coal per unit of electricity, for instance. Therefore, the cost, the fee will be half, and it will give an advantage to natural gas over coal, but it will give an advantage to windmills over natural gas. Okay, what about the employees in the carbon industry? That's a great question. And so what this legislation does, it's just very simple: carbon fee and equitable use of the dividends, equitable use of the proceeds. It does not do anything for the transition that will be necessary over 30 years in coal communities, for instance. So there should be complementary legislation to complement this, to address some of those issues. And for instance, there might be complementary legislation on research and development as well as another area that some people want to add incentives there, or add more money there as well. And then sustainable electricity is solar and wind. What are our thoughts about nuclear? You know, that's a great question too. So that's, when it comes to carbon emissions, they're all the same. They're all zero carbon. But I'd say every one of these technologies maybe has other externalities that people might worry about or care about. And some people have strong opinions on nuclear. Some people have strong opinions on wind and solar, for that matter, wind, for instance, and birds or something like that. So there are other externalities that need to be considered. Citizens Climate Lobby, or no, the Biden administration, I just saw yesterday, came out and said that nuclear will be, that they do want to make sure nuclear is considered zero carbon and take advantage of the benefits of nuclear in this transition. So Citizens Climate Lobby doesn't really have a position that I'm aware of in terms of should nuclear be part of the solution. My own personal opinion is it's a big, difficult transition, and we should consider nuclear as well, making sure it's as safe as possible. But
there's some other questions. Jane just put one in. Can you see that,
yeah,
Bill, and read?
These are great questions. And I think the international side of things, in a way, is the most interesting because, you know, to different extents, many other countries are doing things, especially Europe. So for instance, they have a cap and trade, and that, you know, so they're fixing the amount of pollution and then letting the price determine, you know, come out by market process, and it's $50 per ton, and it's high enough to be causing, you know, it's causing transitions to happen in Europe. And so Canada has basically the same fee and dividend that we're encouraging in the US. So they already have that. And both of those countries are putting on border adjustments because they want to protect their industries. So those border adjustments basically are going to say, we're going to need to put a tariff on US goods unless the US does something similar in terms of putting a price or regulation of some sort on carbon emissions. China is the big one, and they have now a cap and trade that they just introduced in February in their electricity sector. And they have big plans to adjust the transportation sector as well and the rest of their emissions. But they're a big country, so a lot is still to come with China. And I think global pressure on China will be important to make sure that they continue on that path as well.
Bill, can we get two more questions in 5 minutes or so?
Sure.
We have Liz Kunkel, you have your icon hand.
I see the hand. Yep.
I do. Let's see if I can lower my hand. Okay, I can. Yay. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for doing this. Sorry, I'm off screen. I'm multitasking, needless to say, this morning and moving around too much. It would make your head spin to watch. So I don't have a question. Actually, I have an FYI for everybody for the Nutrier ballot, and specifically our family voted by mail a couple days ago, and so we had the hard copy ballot, and I wanted to mention whether you vote in person or by mail, this advisory question on the Nutrier ballot literally is the only question on the second page of the ballot in the top upper left-hand corner. So there's nothing else on the page. If people don't know to look for it, they might actually miss it. There is the red text on the bottom of the first page that says turn it over. But literally, if people don't know to look for it, it could be missed. So I wanted to mention it to everybody specifically. It's not an ideal placement to literally see. I think if you're at the machines, it'll just be the last question you see, but on the paper ballot, it's literally the only question on the back of the ballot. So look for it. Just wanted to mention that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Liz.
Yeah.
Bill, one more question from Greg Frazados. Does Citizens Climate Lobby support hydrogen power systems?
Well, so, you know, one of the advantages of putting a price on carbon is that it's agnostic in terms of technology. It is basically saying, you know, companies and people that emit, that cause the pollution will pay a price, and how they adapt is completely open-ended. And what that means is it allows for innovation. It allows for innovation in terms of how carbon emissions are lowered, and whether it's efficiency or whether it's new technologies, or for instance, in 20 years, something we haven't even thought of. So I'm not actually very familiar with what exactly that means, hydrogen power systems, I suppose for cars or something like that. But absolutely this would incentivize hydrogen power systems to the extent they're zero carbon, for sure.
Bill, I want to thank you. It's good to see you again. And I want to thank you for your passion, your willingness to be with us, and your belief in grassroots democracy, using the tools available to us as Americans to make the kind of environmental justice changes we need to make. And you also showed us today an example, a very clear example of what environmental justice is. It's not just about the choices we make, although those are important. It's really about changing systems and structures at the very highest level to make the longest possible changes, positive changes. So thank you.
Thank you. That sums it up great. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thanks, everybody. Appreciate you.